So today on Root Docs, which is a podcast mini-series that is dedicated exclusively to the topic of root pathogens, I have an esteemed guest today, Dr. Billy Crow at the University of Florida. And I'm going to lead with the first question right off the bat. Is it nematodes or is it nematodes? Can you settle this one once and for all?
Tomato. I guess it depends on where you went to school at. I call them nematodes, but you won't offend me if you call them nematodes either. So, yeah, I think either's acceptable.
Yeah, and nematodes will be the discussion today. I guess, my second question is, what keeps you so interested in these microscopic worms that you keep on discovering new things about them, each year?
Well, okay, so the whole thing just fascinates me. I mean, I get to see this whole world that nobody else gets to see, right? And I work in a very specialized area that not many people work in. Nobody really works in the degree I in as far as specializing in turfgrass nematodes, right? And so everything I see is often something other people don't get to see. And because I do work in a very specialized area, I'm seeing a lot of things for the first time. And so if you're working with soybean cyst nematode on soybean, right, there's hundreds of research labs that work on soybean cyst nematode on soybeans. But if you're going to work on turfgrass nematodes, there's nobody else doing this. And so that appeals to me. I like problem solving. These things are always doing the unexpected, and you expect them to do one thing and they do something else, and you have to figure out why, and so I don't know, it really appeals to me just from something new all the time. I like figuring out how to make things work, and of course, we see, especially in the diagnostic setting, like I'm in a lot. Generally, in the diagnostics, you see things for the first time.
Yes.
And so we see new things, and so talk about new things like we've not even just getting out of turf a little bit, but foliar nematodes on ornamentals, and you find out new things about those, and on the turf grasses, you work with products and you say, well, that didn't work like I'd expect it to. Why? Then you find out that the nematode has some different behavior you didn't know about, so that part's fun. The least fun part is sitting in the office doing paperwork. So
yeah,
if I can get out in the field or on a microscope, that's when I'm most happy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of one of those things, as a nematologist. I mean, another one, just out of my own curiosity, which group of people do you think you'd fit in more closely with? A group of turf pathologists or the group of turf entomologists? Where do you think you decide if you had to choose which room to enter?
Well, I'm in an entomology and nematology department, so I'm surrounded by entomologists, right? So they're a little weird, but they're good folks.
Yeah.
But I think probably as far as my research collaborations and things is probably more with the plant pathologists. Most people that work with plant parasitic nematodes are plant pathologists. So I don't know. I like everybody. Well, not everybody, but most everybody in both groups.
Yeah. And, self-admittedly, my background is more turf pathology than the fungi, and I'm learning nematodes as fast as I can. And one of the things that it just reminds me of, and just talking about nematodes, yes, Florida, but outside of Florida, broader North America, is that it reminds me of Anthracnose. And you're probably, viewers may be scratching their heads, what the heck am I talking about? it wasn't that long ago that anthracnose was thought of as this pretty much secondary disease. It's a disease that shows up afterwards, and it wasn't really a primary problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken years of research. You know, the guys at Rutgers, they do an awesome job at teaching it. And finally, now it's accepted that anthracnose is a primary disease. And I think that's starting to happen with nematodes now throughout the broader North America. Even people up north, you know, even where I spent 3.5 years with Enview in Canada, they're now looking at this as, hey, nematodes are an actual problem, and that pendulum is starting to swing in that direction. And you've definitely played a big role in that.
Well, you know, it's one of these things. Sometimes nematodes don't get any credit, and sometimes they get blamed for everything. And so the truth's probably in the middle there somewhere. But you know, so if you're in Florida, the default. So we're gonna blame nematodes for every problem we have. And often that's true, but not always, right?
Yeah. Yep. I am actually, I said no PowerPoint slides, but I do want to share something that, in terms of learning more about nematodes and some of my brief experience in Canada. And I'm going to show this right here. And so, I asked questions about nematodes and why you keep being interested in them. And I saw your recent webinar you gave for TurfNet. It was outstanding. Really enjoyed it. And I remember this experience that I had in Vancouver when I was up in Canada. And I was talking with a couple of distribution reps, and then ultimately the sports turf manager, who had these patches of chlorotic perennial ryegrass on a sod farm, and this is in Vancouver. And it was, you could imagine every fungicide known to man was applied on this turf. Mm-hmm. Nothing was responding. We were wondering what the heck is causing these patches. And then I happened to check on Twitter, and this researcher out in the UK working with root knot nematodes on ryegrass, I couldn't help but see the parallels in just visual symptoms. Mm-hmm. And if you just go by visual symptoms, anything can be a nematode, anything can be this. But finally, they tested for it, and it was root knot nematode in ryegrass.
Yeah.
Ryegrass on sports field height turf in British Columbia. I mean, I just feel like this is just one example of nematodes as being one of those things that we are going to continue to learn so much more about.
Do you know what kind of what are they going in native soils, or do they have sand-based construction on these fields, or what are they?
This one, they were sand top dressing, but I think they were soil, but they've been putting sand on top of them for quite a few years. Mm-hmm.
So that your picture you're showing from Debbie Cox there, when in the UK, this started seeing those blotches showing up on creeping bent grass back probably a little over 20 years ago. And like you said, they thought it was fungi, causing these problems, and after several years working with this, they found it was this Melodigae minor, this one type of root knot nematode, which is native over there, but it was only became a problem in push-up greens when they went to sand-based construction. Yep. And on creeping bent grass. But it was on the POA and stuff all this time. I never heard them until they modified the actual went to USGA spec construction and creeping bent grass. So
yeah, and would you say, I guess just broadly, that nematodes prefer more of a sand root zone versus, say, a soil root zone?
Most of the ones that we have problems with, not all nematodes, obviously, but some actually prefer heavier soils. But the worst ones tend to favor those sand.
Yeah. Yep. And now I'm just spitballing, in terms of why nematodes seem to be becoming, increasingly abundant. There's a lot of reasons to top dress greens over time with sand, but it's almost like at one time there may have not been that favorable environment. If we just look at like soil greens, push-up greens, but over time, it's like we essentially built that house for them on these greens by, in sometimes decades long top dressing programs. It kind of makes you think if that's one of the reasons we're seeing more nematodes.
Yeah, that's one. Like, so we have made this move to more sand-based construction. Along with that, with a lot of the warm season grasses, you have these nematodes like Sting Nematode that really needs sandy soil to survive. And now it's native to Florida. We're mostly sand, but we've brought that nematode on contaminated planting material, and now you'll find it in putting greens in Texas and Missouri and Oklahoma and places where they've moved Bermuda grass and Zoysia grass and brought the nematode with it. And you get in a sand-based putting green, and it's a perfect environment for that nematode. So we've also had this spreading of some of these really bad nematodes like that. There's also our cultural practices are more and more severe. We're managing these greens right on the verge of death all the time, right?
Yep.
And so when people weren't so concerned about green speed and all these things, and but we're keeping as much as close to that edge as we can without pushing it over, and then the nematodes can be the thing that push them over. So
so you're saying grass normally shouldn't be mowed at an eighth of an inch or a tenth of an inch?
yeah, typically not. No.
Yeah,
We're there's a lot of factors. The things we're doing culturally. Like I said, your plant disease triangle with your pathogen and your host and your environment, and we are constantly that environment making it more favorable for these nematodes, and also we're now again. I get asked this all the time about global climate change, and over time is our transition zone going to go further north? And if so, you could expect again that nematodes are going to be more of a problem as that occurs. So there's several things going on there.
Yeah, and going back to a lot of the research that your lab has done, it's almost to the point where if a superintendent says, Jesse, I got nematodes, tell me what to do, it's almost kind of confusing to answer that one. It's the same thing if a superintendent said, hey, Jesse, I got fungus on my course, what do I spray?
Yeah.
It's like a collective term. But you guys have really dialed in, especially for the big three, which would be root knot, sting, and lance that you guys have in Florida, that it's pretty important to know exactly which nematode you're trying to combat, and you need that right away before you even start management programs.
Yeah. So back when we had Nemacure, which again, an organophosphate nerve toxin that was systemic, that wasn't such a concern, right? Because that stuff would kill all these nematodes. But with our new, nematode management techniques, we got different ones that could work just as well as Nemacure did, but only on certain conditions and in certain nematodes. And so that's where you really have to know the nematode you're trying to manage, how it behaves, and also the properties of your nematicide, how it moves, and how long it stays around, and in the nematicides too are a lot more selective too. So some just don't work on some nematodes and do work on others. And whether the nematodes endoparasitic, ectoparasitic, nematodes move up and down in the soil, so you got to know kind of what they're doing. So the best nematicide in the world is only going to work if it comes in contact with that nematode, right?
Yep.
And so you got to know how the product moves, how the nematode moves, and
And
so
the time of year when the certain nematode could be most vulnerable to a nematicide application.
correct.
And the ectoparasitic nematodes, those are the ones that are living outside.
Hmm.
And then the endoparasitic ones would be something like root knot nematode, where they're doing a lot of their life inside the root.
Correct. And so, I said the good thing, like I said, when we had Nemacure, because it was systemic, it would get the nematodes inside the roots. And it also had contact activity. We get the ones
Again,
out in the
yep,
soil. Um, you know, almost all of our nematicides today are contacts, and so which makes it more difficult to control the endoparasites to spend most of their time living inside the root, and so that becomes more of a challenge. And some nematodes, like the root knot nematodes, at least on warm season grasses, because again, I don't know how the ones behave up up
yeah,
north, but because I'm in Florida, right? People always ask
yep,
me about cool season grasses. I say, well, yeah, I just where I
yeah,
geographically, I'm not going to drive all the way up to do trials up in Minnesota or somewhere, right? So I got plenty to do here. But our nematodes here, we of course we study these things all the time, and we it's very important. We find like where they tend to be in the soil profile, and that's where the movement of your product comes into play. If the nematodes are down deeper, you need something more mobile. If they're right up at the top, you can use things that are less mobile. But you know, and then the length of this that the material's active as well. If you have a really short half life, then with those endoparasites, you may get a few the ones that are out in the soil when you apply it, but if you don't have any residual activity, nematodes are inside the roots when they have lay their eggs and their eggs hatch and come out. They're not going to be exposed to that. So you got to either put something out, over time periodically, or like I said, have something that lasts for a long time.
yeah. And then I think diagnosing nematodes, it has to be sometimes maddening for everyone because of how not to say random, but how variable some of these nematode counts could be. There's
Mm-hmm.
where the superintendent or end user pulled the plugs. Where in that green did he pull them? Then
Mm-hmm.
they're sent off to a lab, and was it mist extraction? Was it soil extraction?
Mm-hmm.
This stuff can be pretty challenging because just how variable the entire process can be. And sometimes, you could be using nematicides on the golf course, and we say this, other manufacturers say this, that, sometimes when you're using a nematicide and you're seeing that improvement in turf quality, there is a chance if you take the samples from the same spot again, that sometimes your numbers could be even higher.
Yes.
And is that because maybe there's been some root length and there's some even more food there, which would theoretically.
Yeah. So if you've got your roots that deep and you got 50 sting nematodes, that's really bad.
Mm-hmm.
I've got roots this deep and have 50 sting nematodes, I'm not so concerned, right?
Yep.
And so, as we, again, none of these nematicides are going to get rid of all these nematodes, right?
Yep.
And so, with a successful treatment, again, you're going to get more roots growing, which equates to more nematode food. And so you can have higher populations. And that's why, again, I try to, when I'm educating people, if you want to see if a product's working, focus on the roots. Are my roots improving? Is my grass getting better? More than the counts. The counts are there to kind of give you an idea. What if nematodes are a problem, if so, which ones? But
Yep.
they're less useful. And I get this all the time. People, I put out a nematicide, and they take a sample 2 weeks later, a month later, 6 weeks later, and either they haven't went down, or there's even more. And well, how's the grass doing? Did it improve? Yeah, yeah. Your roots are doing good. Okay,
Yeah.
you're fine. That's what you
Yeah.
want. So, yeah, I kind of I'm trying to get people from getting that mindset where they want to put it out and then see all their nematodes go away. You
Yeah.
focus more on the actual health of the grass, to whether that your treatment's working or not.
Yep. And one of the other things that kind of makes it complicated, and some of the turf pathologists say this, that, I've looked under a microscope before,
Mhm.
and you can get lost in there. What's underneath that cover slip, you just see so many different things. And, I would see nematodes swimming around. I would see all these, other pathogens. How often do you tend to see an association of nematodes with other root pathogens, such as, say, something like a pythium or something that causes a take-all root rot? How often do you see them together? And do you think they're making issues worse when
Uh,
they're tag teaming it?
well, I guess the first thing is most of the time. Okay, again, you've always got all these fungi out there. You got your Pythium and take all, Gamenomyces is every place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so your nematodes do a lot of wounding to roots, which cause entry points for fungi. And nematodes are a common predisposing factor to getting fungal disease. And this is also why, for decades now, when I was actually my first year as an assistant professor, one of the first things we did is, Syngenta just came out with oxystrobin. And so we were putting that out with Nemacure, and we were seeing we got better nematode control, better fungal control, and way better turf responses than either the nematicide by itself or the fungicide by itself. And that's where I've often recommended nematicides be used as part of a good fungicide program. And why we're seeing things like with you guys' new products, you got your Zoysia shirt on there. You get you're getting fungal control and the nematode control, getting both organisms at the same time. So, but yeah, they regularly interact, and so when you control both, you'll get a lot better response.
Yeah, that definitely seems to make a lot of sense. There's always something kind of munching around in there. Billy, I think you're right. I think you belong in that turf pathologist room, and working with them. There's so much more to figure out with all of this. And you brought up Resilia. It's just the product advertising, not intentionally, actually.
Product placement, yeah.
Yeah, and with something like Resilia, and you mentioned this in the we had a researcher happy hour on May 4th where we talked about Resilia, and to each of them it means something a little different. With some people they're more concerned with Pythium root rot, some take all, and it kind of fits into those categories. But in terms of nematode management, how would you compare and contrast the single shot of fluopyram, say with something like Indemnify, versus say that monthly app or so of Resilia at a reduced rate, but at a more consistent interval? What would be the
So it's going to depend on your nematode you're trying to manage. Okay, so like I said, on our Bermuda grasses, our root knot nematodes are typically right up at the top. Okay, and our sting nematodes are going to be down here. And so, you don't need as much nematicide to kill nematodes up here as down here, right? Because as you're moving it down, the further down you're moving it, you're losing some. Okay, so you have to apply a lot more to the top to get it down deeper to get the sting nematodes. We found that because the root knot nematodes stay right up at the top, you don't need to put out as much on the top to get the same level of exposure. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so now fluopyram, it's not real mobile, but it is mobile. Okay, so I typically get about 6 to 8 weeks of control of root knot nematodes with fluopyrium before it starts moving down. Okay,
Yep.
so now the way the indemnify label is written, if I'm going to do multiple applications of that spot treatment rate, I have to do
The full
the
rate.
full rate. I can't use a quarter amount, right?
Yep.
So if I guess where I'm going, if I'm trying to control sting nematodes, I would say indemnify with what you want to use and put all that at once and get it to move down as a big.
Because that's where there are, especially in the summer, they move down, right? The sting.
Yes, yeah. But when I'm in our warm season grasses, typically I would generally apply it in November, and then it kind of moves down and it's where I want it to be by the time the grass starts warming up and the nematodes
So
get
you're
active.
almost leading the receiver with that approach.
You
You're
are,
almost
you
leading
are.
it. Yep.
Right.
That makes sense.
And so I guess where I'm getting at with root knot nematodes, I think you would be better off doing Resilia because you're only putting about the quarter amount of fluopyrium, but I'm doing it 4 times. Now you could do 4 applications in indemnify. You guys would sell a lot more material, but you don't need that much. And the other thing I found in both my greenhouse and research and field research trials is my turf response is just as good with doing 4 apps of Resilia as the 4 apps of indemnify. And so for root knot nematodes, you're better off going with the Resilia, doing 4 applications at, let's say 6 to 8 week intervals. If I'm going to control sting nematodes, I would hit it with indemnify with 1 big shot.
Yep. That makes sense. Some of the other things that I've wondered, and I'm just like throwing random questions out there, and I get this sometimes, is, whenever we have new grass species, we may have new issues pop up on them. You mentioned the disease triangle. When we get a new host or we're managing the host different, then we could see some new things develop on those. I've seen some pretty interesting things on some of these Zoysia putting greens. Do you think Zoysia greens are going to have some of the same nematode issues that some of these Bermuda greens would have?
Zoysia is like the most nematode susceptible grass known to man. Okay,
I didn't know that.
yeah, they love Zoysia grass. Okay, and Zoysias tend to have a shallower root system than Bermuda in general, and so the damage tends to be more severe. But all of our nematodes that that get on our Bermuda grasses love Zoysia grass, and so it gets hammered by sting nematodes, root knot nematodes, lance nematodes, stubby root nematodes. They all love Zoysia grass.
Yeah, I believe it. And then from a disease perspective, I think it's going to get all the diseases that Zoysia grass gets just on putting green height. But some people like it. It's just we're going to have to learn to manage some of those issues, and whether you're managing Seashore Paspalum, if you're managing that in Florida, you got a whole separate issues, and that gets microdochium like crazy, dollar spot like crazy. You're going to have all those different issues as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Seashore Paspalum. Here's another example. I mean, that grass is highly susceptible to spiral nematodes. And spiral nematodes are a very minor issue on Bermuda, but they're a major issue on Seashore Paspalum. So there's an example, again, where this grass is more susceptible to this one nematode that other grasses, don't suffer much damage from it.
Yeah. Yep. And so as you keep plugging along doing all this research that your lab is doing, what areas do you want to kind of move into as far as what are you most excited about in terms of learning more about the biology of some of these nematodes?
Oh goodness. We're doing right now. We're doing a lot of work with resistance and resistance management. Okay,
Yep.
so you've probably heard now we have in Florida populations of root knot and sting nematodes that have become resistant to fluopyrium and probably other SDHI nematicides as they come out, right? These SDHIs are probably the most effective nematicides we have, but because they last for so long in the soil, they're more prone, I think, going to be more prone to resistance, and so we want to try to use those sparingly. And so we're doing a lot of research right now with resistance management. So we're doing a lot with nematicide rotations. You're rotating SDHI nematicides with other nematicides that may not be as effective, but if I rotate with them, I can use the SDHIs less often and hopefully have less resistance issues. We're going to be looking at mechanisms of resistance and what actually genes are involved. I hope to be able to, in the near future, be able to have a molecular test for resistance. And so if a golf course wants to know if they have resistant nematodes, we'll be able to test that and tell them. These are some of the, I guess, bigger projects we're working on there.
Yeah, and so eventually we'll have as new introductions come to the market, stronger rotational options, and so we'll have just like pathogens and diseases, anything in the disease world. They say anything that can, and in the insect world, anything that can churn over multiple generations a year, that's a certain risk factor. And in Florida, it makes it super challenging for the end user, because now I'm just, with diseases, rotating modes of action in their fungicide program, their nematicide program, they're going to be rotating modes of action. In Florida, Bermuda grass mites are becoming a bigger deal all up along the Carolina coast as well. And just like mites can have 5 generations or so a year in southern Florida. So having a rotational miticide program, it never surprises me how many things the state of Florida has. And I joke around with Todd Lowe all the time. He's our technical rep in Florida. That there is no winter. There is always something every month of the season that we're doing. It's either we're doing our nematicide program, we're hunkering down with fungicides, managing bill bugs and miticides. There's never a dull moment in that state.
Yep. And what this one nematologist I went to graduate school with, he became the extension nematologist in Minnesota, right? And so this guy works with one nematode on one plant, soybean cyst nematode on soybeans. Okay, and soybeans only grow for 5 months. But in Florida, people are dinging me constantly, and it never slows down. I'm kind of, hyper, I guess, is what they used to call me when I was a kid. But, so I like keeping busy, well, sometimes I get a little, overwhelmed on occasion, it's just the amount of work we have to do. But I like that. I don't do very well when I get bored, and I haven't never got bored yet, and I'm sure I won't.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we absolutely, I say we as an industry absolutely appreciate your dedication to nematode research. You've played a big role in improving people, their golf operations, and getting those nematodes under control. And Billy, I really appreciate you being a part of the Root Docs podcast. I think guys will be very excited about this one. We've had some pathologists on board, and I think it was absolutely fitting to have a nematologist with us today. So thanks, Billy, for taking the time and being on the show.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, and I'm always here if you want me to come back.